The grand ballroom fell silent as the heavy oak doors swung open with a dramatic creak. Every head turned, every conversation stopped, and even the string quartet seemed to miss a beat. There she stood, the woman nobody expected to see at this million-dollar wedding. Richard's face went white as a ghost. His bride-to-be, Catherine, dropped her champagne glass, and it shattered across the marble floor like broken dreams. The woman in the doorway wore a simple black dress, but something about the way she carried herself made her look like royalty walking into a room full of pretenders. "Hello, Richard," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the stunned silence like thunder. "Thank you for the invitation. Subscribe to this channel to support our growth. But wait, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. Now, let me tell you how we got to this moment that would change everything. 6 months earlier, life looked very different for Richard and Sarah. They lived in a tiny apartment above Mrs. Chen's grocery store, where the walls were paper-thin and the heating never worked properly. Sarah would wake up every morning at 4 a.m. to start her day at the local bakery, kneading dough with hands that were always covered in flour and small cuts from years of hard work. Richard worked at a construction company, but the jobs were never steady. Some weeks he made good money. Other weeks he sat at home staring at unpaid bills while Sarah counted pennies to buy groceries. Their love story had started in high school when they were both dreamers who believed love could conquer anything. "We'll make it work, Ricky," Sarah would say, using the nickname only she was allowed to call him. She'd kiss his forehead after another rejection letter came in the mail. "We just need to keep trying." But Richard was growing tired of trying. He was tired of wearing the same 3 shirts to job interviews. Tired of eating beans and rice for dinner 5 nights a week. Most of all, he was tired of seeing his old classmates posting pictures of their new cars and fancy vacations on social media, while he couldn't even afford to take Sarah out for a proper dinner. The breaking point came on a cold Tuesday morning in February. Richard had been laid off again, the 3rd time that year. He sat at their kitchen table, which was really just a folding table covered with a checkered cloth Sarah had sewn herself, staring at a pile of overdue bills. "The rent is due tomorrow," he said without looking up. "Mrs. Chun has already been patient with us twice." Sarah wiped her floury hands on her apron. She'd been up since 3 a.m. baking bread at Martinez Bakery, and her shift at the diner didn't start for another hour. "I can pick up extra shifts at the diner. Maybe work weekends too." "You're already working 7 days a week, Sarah. When do you sleep? When do you rest?" Richard's voice cracked with frustration. "I rest when we're secure," she replied gently. "When we don't have to worry about money anymore." "And when will that be?" Richard slammed his hand on the table, making the bills scatter. "When we're 60, 70? I'm tired of living like this." Sarah sat down across from him, reaching for his hand. Her fingers were rough from work, but her touch was still gentle. "Richard, we knew it would be hard, but we have each other. Isn't that enough?" For a moment, Richard's anger softened as he looked into her brown eyes, the same eyes that had looked at him with such hope on their wedding day 3 years ago. They'd gotten married at City Hall with 2 witnesses they'd found in the hallway, and their honeymoon was a picnic in the park with sandwiches Sarah had made. But then he looked around their tiny apartment, at the leaky ceiling they couldn't afford to fix, at the second-hand furniture that was falling apart, at the empty refrigerator that hummed too loudly because it was older than he was. "Maybe it's not enough anymore," he whispered. Sarah's face fell like someone had punched her in the stomach. "What do you mean?" "I mean, look at us, Sarah. Look at this place. Look at our lives. We're going nowhere fast. And I can't pretend that love is going to pay our bills or put food on our table. Love doesn't pay bills, but it gives us the strength to work for what we need," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Richard, please don't say things you don't mean when you're upset." But Richard was already standing up, pacing around their small living room like a caged animal. "What if I do mean it? What if I'm tired of being poor? What if I want more than this? Then we'll work for more. Together. Together." Richard laughed bitterly. "Sarah, we've been together for 5 years, married for 3, and we're worse off now than when we started. Maybe the problem isn't bad luck. Maybe the problem is us. Maybe the problem is you. The words hung in the air like poison. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. Me? You're always so content with nothing. You never want to take risks. You never push for better opportunities. You're happy living in this dump as long as we're together, and maybe that's what's holding us back. Sarah stood up slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. I work 3 jobs, Richard. I haven't bought myself anything new in 2 years so we could save money. I give you every penny I earn. How am I holding us back? Richard couldn't meet her eyes. Deep down, he knew she was right. Sarah had sacrificed everything for their relationship. She'd dropped out of community college to work more hours when he lost his job the first time. She'd sold her grandmother's ring, the only valuable thing she owned, to pay for his certification course that was supposed to get him better work. But admitting that would mean admitting that their problems weren't her fault. That maybe he was the one who wasn't trying hard enough. That maybe he was looking for someone to blame instead of looking for solutions. I need some air, he said, grabbing his jacket. Richard, please, let's talk about this. We can figure it out. But he was already out the door, leaving Sarah alone in their tiny apartment with nothing but the sound of dripping from the leaky faucet they couldn't afford to fix. Richard walked the cold streets for hours, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his breath visible in small puffs. He found himself at Murphy's Bar, a place he couldn't afford to drink at, but sometimes sat in the corner nursing 1 beer for 2 hours just to feel normal. That's where he met Catherine. She was sitting alone at the bar, wearing a coat that probably cost more than Richard made in 6 months. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and her nails were manicured in a way that told Richard she'd never worked a day with her hands the way Sarah did. Rough night? She asked, noticing his expression. Richard looked up at her, taking in her perfect makeup and expensive jewelry. You could say that. Want to talk about it? I'm Catherine, by the way. She extended a perfectly manicured hand. Richard. He shook her hand, noticing how soft it was. And no, you probably don't want to hear about my problems. Catherine smiled, and it was the kind of smile that belonged in magazines. Try me. I've got time. And you look like you could use a friend. So Richard found himself telling this stranger about his struggles. About feeling trapped in poverty. About wanting more from life but not knowing how to get it. He didn't mention Sarah directly, but he talked about feeling held back by people who were too comfortable with failure. Catherine listened with interest, occasionally asking questions that made Richard feel heard in a way he hadn't felt in years. When he mentioned he worked construction, she perked up. My father owns Hamilton Real Estate, she said casually, as if she hadn't just mentioned one of the biggest property development companies in the state. He's always looking for reliable contractors. Maybe I could put in a good word for you. Richard's heart jumped. Hamilton Real Estate was the kind of company that could change his entire life. You would do that? For someone you just met? Catherine leaned closer, and he caught a whiff of expensive perfume. I believe in helping people who want to help themselves. You seem like someone who's ready to leave his old life behind and start fresh. Those words, leave his old life behind, stuck in Richard's mind like a hook. What if he could? What if he could just start over? Without the constant struggle, without the embarrassment of poverty, without Sarah. The thought crept into his mind like a snake, quiet and poisonous. Catherine was offering him a chance at the life he'd always wanted. But that life didn't include a wife who was content with scraping by. It didn't include someone who reminded him every day of where he came from and how little he had achieved. I'd be very interested in meeting your father, Richard said finally. Catherine's smile widened. I thought you might be. Why don't you give me your number, and I'll set something up? As Richard wrote his number on a napkin, he felt like he was signing his name on a contract with the devil. But the devil was offering him everything he'd ever wanted, and all he had to do was turn his back on everything he'd ever had. The next morning, Richard came home to find Sarah making breakfast with ingredients she'd probably borrowed from Mrs. Chun. She looked up with hopeful eyes when he walked in, as if the fight had never happened. I made your favorite, she said quietly. Scrambled eggs with cheese. I know we can't afford the good cheese, but I saved up some tips from the diner. Richard looked at her standing there in her worn pajamas, trying to make peace with breakfast she could barely afford, and he felt something break inside his chest. But instead of guilt or love, what he felt was irritation. Here she was again, making the best of a bad situation instead of demanding better. Sarah, we need to talk. She turned off the stove and faced him, her hands clasped in front of her like she was praying. Maybe she was. I've been thinking about what I said yesterday, Richard began, and Sarah's face lit up with hope. And I realized that I was right. We're not good for each other anymore. The hope died in her eyes so quickly it was like watching someone flip a switch. What are you saying? I'm saying that we want different things. You're happy living like this, and I'm not. You're holding me back from the life I deserve. Richard, please. No, Sarah. My mind is made up. I'm leaving. Sarah staggered backward like he'd hit her. Leaving? For how long? For good. The words hit the small apartment like a bomb. Sarah gripped the counter to keep from falling, her knuckles turning white. Is there someone else? She whispered. Richard could have been honest. He could have told her about Catherine, about the opportunity, about his decision to choose money over love. But instead, he chose the cruelest lie of all. No, he said. There's no one else. I just can't do this anymore. I can't be married to failure. Sarah's tears came then, silent and devastating. Richard, I love you. We can fix this. We can try harder. You love me. Richard's laugh was bitter and cold. Love doesn't pay rent, Sarah. Love doesn't buy groceries or fix our broken-down car or get us out of this dump. I'm done living on love and good intentions. Please don't leave me, Sarah whispered, and the desperation in her voice should have broken Richard's heart. Instead, it strengthened his resolve. I already have, he said, picking up the suitcase he'd packed while she was asleep. Don't try to contact me. As Richard walked toward the door, Sarah called out one last time. Where will you go? How will I reach you if... You won't, Richard said without turning around. Goodbye, Sarah. The door closed behind him with a finality that echoed through the tiny apartment like a gunshot. Sarah stood alone in the kitchen, the smell of eggs burning on the stove, and felt her entire world collapse around her. But this was only the beginning of her story, and Richard was about to discover that walking away from someone who truly loved him was the biggest mistake of his life. 3 months later, Richard was living in a downtown penthouse, wearing suits that cost more than he used to make in a month, and working as Catherine's father's personal contractor for their luxury developments. He'd been dating Catherine for 6 weeks, and she'd already started talking about marriage. Daddy thinks you're perfect for me? Catherine said one evening as they sat in an expensive restaurant Richard could never have afforded before. He says you have the hunger for success that most men lack. Richard smiled, cutting into a steak that cost $40. I'm just grateful for the opportunity. You've earned it, Catherine replied, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. You left your old life behind and embraced a better future. That takes courage. Richard nodded, but something twisted in his stomach. He'd been having dreams about Sarah lately, dreams where she was trying to call out to him, but he couldn't hear her voice. He'd wake up feeling guilty and try to push the thoughts away by focusing on his new life. Actually, Catherine continued, her eyes sparkling with excitement, Daddy wants to make you a full partner in the Hamilton Development Company, but he says there's one condition. Richard's heart jumped. Partnership would mean millions. It would mean security beyond his wildest dreams. What condition? Catherine grinned and pulled out a small velvet box. He says I can't marry just any contractor, but I can marry my husband, who happens to be his business partner. She opened the box, revealing a diamond ring that caught the restaurant's lights like a tiny star. Richard stared at the ring, his mind spinning. This was everything he'd wanted. Wealth, success, status, a beautiful wife from a powerful family. All he had to do was say yes. Catherine, yes? She asked, bouncing slightly in her seat with excitement. Richard thought about Sarah, probably still living in that tiny apartment above Mrs. Chen's store, still working 3 jobs just to survive. He thought about the life he'd walked away from and the life that was being offered to him now. The choice was easy. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I'll marry you." Catherine squealed with delight and threw her arms around him, and the entire restaurant turned to look at the happy couple. Richard felt like he was in a movie, the kind where the poor guy gets the girl and the fortune and lives happily ever after. But as Catherine called her father to share the good news, and as other diners congratulated them, and as the waiter brought them champagne on the house, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made a deal with the devil. And the devil always collects what she's owed. The wedding planning began immediately. Catherine wanted everything to be perfect, and when you have Hamilton money, perfect is exactly what you get. They rented the Grand Metropolitan Ballroom, hired the city's most expensive caterer, and sent out invitations printed on paper that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week. "It's going to be the social event of the year," Catherine gushed as they looked through sample centerpieces that cost $300 each. "Everyone who matters will be there." Richard nodded and smiled, playing the part of the excited groom. But as the wedding grew more elaborate and expensive, he found himself thinking about his first wedding to Sarah. They'd gotten married at City Hall with 2 witnesses, and afterward they'd shared a gas station hot dog because it was all they could afford. But Sarah had looked at him like he'd given her the moon and stars. "Richard," Catherine's voice snapped him back to reality. "I asked what you thought about the ice sculpture?" Richard looked at the catalog she was showing him. The ice sculpture cost $2,000 and would melt before the reception was half over. "It's perfect," he said. Catherine beamed and made a note in her wedding planner. "Oh, that reminds me. I need your guest list so we can finish the invitations." Richard's stomach dropped. His guest list would be embarrassingly short. A few guys from his old construction crew, maybe his cousin from across town. Nothing like Catherine's list, which included city officials, business leaders, and social elite. "Actually," he said slowly, "I don't have many people to invite." Catherine looked up from her planner, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I don't really have family or close friends who would fit in at this kind of wedding." "Oh, sweetie," Catherine said, reaching over to pat his hand. "That's what I love about you. You're not tied down by people from your past. You're free to become whoever you want to be." But as she said it, Richard felt something cold settle in his chest, because there was one person from his past he couldn't stop thinking about, no matter how hard he tried. That night, alone in his penthouse while Catherine was at her bachelorette party, Richard found himself looking through old photos on his phone. Photos he should have deleted months ago. Photos of him and Sarah laughing at a picnic in the park. Sarah covered in flour from a baking disaster. Sarah asleep on their old couch, exhausted from working 3 jobs but smiling even in her sleep. Before he could stop himself, Richard was looking up Sarah's address. She still lived in the same tiny apartment above Mrs. Chen's store. For a moment, he considered driving over there, knocking on the door, seeing how she was doing. Instead, he did something that surprised even him. He wrote her name and address on one of Catherine's expensive wedding invitations. Richard told himself he was doing it to be cruel, to show Sarah what she was missing, to prove to himself that he'd made the right choice by leaving her for a better life. But deep down, in a place he didn't want to acknowledge, he knew the real reason. He wanted her to see what he'd become. He wanted her to know that he hadn't just survived without her. He'd thrived. And maybe, just maybe, he wanted to see if she still cared enough to show up. The invitation was sent before Richard could change his mind. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in her tiny apartment, staring at the most beautiful piece of paper she'd ever seen. Heavy cardstock with gold lettering, requesting the honor of her presence at the wedding of Richard Hayes and Catherine Hamilton. Sarah read it 3 times, her hands shaking. Richard was getting married to someone else, and he'd invited her to watch. Mrs. Chun knocked on the door just as Sarah was collapsing onto her old couch, the invitation falling from her numb fingers. "Sarah, dear, are you all right?" I heard crying. Sarah opened the door, and Mrs. Chun took one look at her red-rimmed eyes and puffy face and immediately wrapped her in a hug. "What's wrong, child?" Sarah showed her the invitation, and Mrs. Chen's expression grew dark. "That boy," she muttered. That stupid, cruel boy. Why would he send you this? I don't know, Sarah whispered. Maybe he wants me to see how happy he is without me. Maybe he wants to hurt me one more time. Mrs. Chun studied the invitation carefully. Or maybe, she said slowly, he wants to see you again. Sarah looked up, surprised. What do you mean? Men don't invite their ex-wives to their weddings unless they're either very cruel or very confused. And Richard, for all his faults, was never cruel. Not like this. Sarah shook her head. It doesn't matter why he sent it. I'm not going. I can't watch him marry someone else. But Mrs. Chun wasn't finished. Sarah, honey, look at yourself. Really look. Sarah glanced in the mirror across the room and saw what Mrs. Chun meant. In the 6 months since Richard had left, Sarah had changed. The constant stress and sadness had made her lose weight, but it had also made her stronger somehow. She'd started taking night classes again, working toward her business degree. She'd been promoted to assistant manager at the bakery, and her boss had been talking about helping her start her own small bakery someday. She looked different. Sadder, yes, but also more determined. More independent. Like someone who had learned to survive on her own and discovered she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. He left you when you were broken down, Mrs. Chun said gently. But you're not that person anymore, are you? Sarah looked at her reflection again, really seeing herself for the first time in months. Mrs. Chun was right. She wasn't the same woman who had begged Richard not to leave. She was someone who had picked herself up, dusted herself off, and built a life that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or love. No, Sarah said quietly. I'm not. Then maybe, Mrs. Chun said with a small smile. It's time Richard saw who you've become. Sarah picked up the invitation and read it one more time. The wedding was in 3 days at the Grand Metropolitan Ballroom, the kind of place she'd only seen in magazines. I don't have anything to wear to a place like that, Sarah said. Mrs. Chen's smile widened. Leave that to me, dear. I think it's time we showed Richard Hayes exactly what he walked away from. For the first time since receiving the invitation, Sarah felt something other than sadness. She felt powerful. The night before the wedding, Sarah stood in front of her mirror wearing a simple black dress that Mrs. Chun had mysteriously produced from a friend who owed her a favor. It wasn't expensive or flashy, but it fit her perfectly and made her look elegant in a way that had nothing to do with money. Sarah had spent the day getting ready, not just physically, but emotionally. She'd written down everything she wanted to say to Richard if she got the chance. All the words she'd wished she'd said when he walked out. All the truths she'd learned about herself in the months since he'd abandoned her. She wasn't going to the wedding to win him back. She wasn't going to make a scene or cause drama. She was going because she deserved to face the man who had broken her heart and show him that he hadn't broken her spirit. As Sarah looked at herself in the mirror, she made a promise. Tomorrow she would walk into that ballroom with her head held high. She would be gracious and dignified, and she would make sure that Richard Hayes understood exactly what kind of woman he had chosen to throw away. The wedding day arrived with perfect weather and everything going according to Catherine's detailed plan. The Grand Metropolitan Ballroom was transformed into a fairy tale setting with thousands of white roses, crystal chandeliers, and enough gold accents to blind someone if they looked too closely. Richard stood at the altar in a tuxedo that cost more than his old monthly rent, watching the guests file in. Politicians, business leaders, socialites. Everyone who mattered in their city was there to witness his marriage to Catherine Hamilton. But as the ceremony time approached, Richard found himself scanning the crowd for one face. Had she come? Would she actually show up? Part of him hoped she wouldn't. Part of him hoped she'd thrown the invitation away and moved on with her life. But another part of him, a part he didn't want to acknowledge, desperately wanted to see her again. The wedding march began, and Catherine appeared at the back of the ballroom in a dress that probably cost more than most people's cars. She looked perfect, like something out of a fairy tale, walking down the aisle toward her Prince Charming and their happily ever after. Richard forced himself to smile as Catherine approached, but his eyes kept drifting to the crowd, searching for a familiar face among all the strangers. And then, just as Catherine reached the altar, The ballroom doors opened one more time. Richard's breath caught in his throat as he saw who was walking in. It was Sarah. But this wasn't the broken, desperate woman he'd left behind 6 months ago. This was someone new, someone confident and strong. Someone who walked into that room like she belonged there despite wearing a simple dress among all the designer gowns. Every head in the ballroom turned to look at the late arrival, and Richard felt his world tilt on its axis. Sarah's eyes met his across the crowded room, and for a moment, time stopped completely. Then she smiled. Not the sad, pleading smile he remembered, but something new, something that looked almost like pity. And Richard realized that his perfect wedding was about to become very, very complicated. Subscribe to this channel to support our growth as we dive deeper into this dramatic story.